Hi, everyone, and welcome. We're so thrilled that you joined us today. My name is Kim Bodemer. I'm the director of Talmid of Hebrew College, your home for high quality adult learning. Growth sessions are designed to be opportunities for participants to gather and reflect, observe, and wrestle with important thoughts, ideas, and events in our lives today. Today's session is a quintessential example of this. We are grateful that Reverend Rob Schenck has agreed to join us today in conversation with Rabbi Or Rose, the founding director of the Betty Ann Greenbaum Miller Center for Interreligious Learning and Leadership of Hebrew College. It's a mouthful, to explore a history and an analysis of the nexus between American evangelicalism, MAGA, and other current right-wing Christian religious political phenomena. Rob has a very personal story after spending 3 decades as a Capitol Hill-based conservative religious activist. He broke with his community on theological and social issues in 2014. Rob will tell us more of his story during this presentation, but a little bit about the context of how Rob and Orr came to be in relationship. They met 6 years ago at a small gathering of activists and artists on a rooftop in Manhattan. Orr's son, then 13, insisted that the three of them have a long conversation about religion and politics that lasted past midnight. And since that time, Rob and Orr have collaborated on a variety of projects, including creating a Jewish evangelical dialogue group for leaders across the country. They are both deeply committed to engagement across difference and the need for religious leaders and communities to play constructive roles in upholding democracy and caring for the vulnerable in our midst. You'll have opportunities to ask questions using the chat feature, and we're going to leave time at the end to address as many of these questions as possible. So without further ado, I'd like to officially welcome Rob and Orr, and I'm going to spotlight them for everyone so you'll be able to see them. And thank you so much for being here.
Hi, folks. This is a first for me. Can you hear me? Yes? Can I get a emoji or a human appendage?
Yes.
I am actually getting out of a Manhattan taxi cab and beginning this conversation on Central Park West. So I apologize for any noise. I'm going to sit down, take a breath, and welcome my dear friend and colleague, Rob Schenck. And I really apologize for the noise. But mostly you're going to be hearing from Rob, so I'll mute myself in a moment. The way that Rob and I designed this conversation is that we wanted to do it in 3 segments. I'm going to invite Rob momentarily to share with you something of his personal story. Then we're going to move to a reflection on the growth and development of the evangelical movement in the United States. And then the third part is going to be about the current concerns and dangers, as Rob is a consummate insider and a critical analyst. So with that, Rob, I'm going to invite you in this first segment to share something of your journey. It's an unusual one, from Buffalo to Washington, D.C., to Newton, Massachusetts, and many other places in between, geographically and spiritually. So go for it. And already our first comment in the chat is "Go Bills." And I will mute myself so that I can listen to you.
Yeah, well, if I understand that right, it rings the bell for me because I am a creature of Western New York and Buffalo in particular, where I grew up. Uh, you, just to get the right era, I'll turn 68 in October. So most of my life was spent literally on the Canadian border, which makes me feel so close to you. Or right, literally on an island, Grand Island, New York. If you've ever driven to Niagara Falls, you pass on Route 90, you go across the island where I lived. The west side, northwest side, bordered Canada at Erie, Ontario, and the other side looked over on the suburbs of Buffalo, New York. So I was a border kid spending Canadian and U.S. money and crossing the Rainbow Bridge on foot to buy my fireworks so that we could terrorize tourists in those days. Anyway, that's a little of the personal history. I grew up in a non-religious home. My father, born and raised in Reform Judaism. My mother, born baptized Catholic, raised Episcopalian by the time she married my father in 1954. She really didn't have a faith she would call her own. And my parents raised their four children to make our own decisions about religion. I went out searching in my teens and fell on a little country Methodist church that had an evangelical heritage. It had once been part of the Evangelical United Brethren, who are pacifists, basically, conscientious objectors. They're part of the illustrious Peace Church family. And that's where I first heard the message of Jesus, uh, basically in the preaching of what Christians refer to as the Sermon on the Mount, that classic series of teachings that gets deeply into morality and ethics, and particularly treatment of our neighbor, the marginalized, the lonely, the forgotten, those who are mourning. And I found it very appealing, as I did the ethos or the culture of that particular church family. Again, they were pacifists. I was against the Vietnam War. In fact, my first foray into activism was marching in an anti-war demonstration, very young. I think I was 12 or 13. And that fell in line with our family's culture. Um, and as happens in many evangelical churches, an evangelist came by on a Wednesday night during Holy Week leading up to Easter. His name was Peter Bolt. I'll never forget him, from Plymouth, England. And he explained how one becomes a Christian by professing Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. And you may be familiar with all of this. Evangelicals refer to this as the second birth, a born again experience. And I responded to that invitation. I went forward in the sanctuary of this small, almost chapel-like building, and made that profession of faith, which would chart the course of the rest of my life to the present moment. It surprises people to learn that 2 years later, I would cast my first vote for president, and for who else but Jimmy Carter, because to me, he was the most like Jesus. And I just thought there's no other choice to be made. So I cast my vote for a Democrat. I would not vote for a Democrat again for 40 years. And the reason for that is because very shortly after that, I was on board with what I now refer to as Ronald Reagan Republican religion, after Reagan made a pact with one of the most formidable figures in evangelicalism at that time. Jerry Falwell Sr., the founder of what is now the largest evangelical institution of higher learning in the world, Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. I was an admirer of his preaching style, and when he said, Reagan is our man to champion our beliefs and convictions, I was all in. By then, I had taken my seat at the table of national evangelical leadership as a member, a very active member of the National Association of Evangelicals. Reagan was the first sitting president to address such a body. I came under the wash of presidential affirmation, and I became a Republican, and that would put me on a trajectory to become a culture warrior. By the time I was in my 30s, I was a leader in the national anti-abortion movement. And that would eventually take me to Washington, D.C. as an appointed missionary to top elected officials. I spent a lot of time with leaders of Congress. I established a headquarters building across the street from the Supreme Court. I would spend time with presidents, go out on the road with Republican presidential candidates, and I would end my uh, missionary career there spending time with the conservative members of the Supreme Court, often in their chambers, praying and talking privately with them. And then when my religious tribe embraced Donald Trump as our champion, that was the beginning of an accelerated end. As early as 2014, I had started questioning uh, what I had given so much of myself to. And that came mostly by reading this guy, my posthumous spiritual mentor, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a young, brave, brilliant World War II church leader in Germany. He did most of his best work in his 20s and 30s in the lead up to the Nazi catastrophe. He would become one of the first voices to speak out against Adolf Hitler and his racialized tyranny. He would die uh, in the Flossenburg concentration camp, hanged by special order of Hitler himself in April 1945 at age 39. He left behind a treasure trove of brilliant and insightful moral theology and Christian ethics, which are found in these blue volumes over my shoulder. I read all 10,000 pages of him. And as a result of that, I experienced an epiphany, an aperçu, you might call it a keen sense of the obvious. And that was that my work on the right wing of American evangelicalism very much paralleled what the Evangelische Kirche, the Evangelical Church of Germany, was doing in that period, including facilitating the Nazi horrors and declaring Adolf Hitler a gift and miracle from God. So that awakening set me on a track to become a loving but fierce critic of my own. And that would eventually take me to a rooftop in Manhattan where I encountered a certain rabbi, and I end up in your company today. So that's the personal story, or I'm not sure where you want me to go from there, but that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, Rob. And I hope I'm not being distracting by navigating my way through the mean streets of New York City, but I'm listening attentively. And every time I hear your story, of course, different threads emerge for me. So I want to gently pull on one, which is, why is it important to you to maintain the title, if you will, or identification with the evangelical movement? You could describe yourself in any number of ways, but in our conversations over the years, you've said it's very important that that term remain. And perhaps you could frame that within some historical context so that people have both the personal meaning, but the personal meaning within the historical unfolding of American evangelical life, particularly since it's such a large body of human beings, and of course, not a monolith.
Yeah, depending on how you count evangelicals in this country, there could be 35 to 100 million of us. There's certainly enough to be consequential, certainly politically, but socially, culturally, and religiously. So, yes, it's a very big family. Worldwide, we're probably 600 million. And within that very large uh, communion, there are many, many different sects, some of them quite oppositional to one another. So you're right. But for me, I still have a great affection for the term. You know, evangelical, some of you are more the religious historians than I am, but the term evangelical first appeared at the time of the Reformation when Martin Luther employed it. I think it had been used sporadically before that, but as a, you know, the term that we know it to be today, it appeared around the time of the Reformation, and it signaled a dramatic shift in the way Christians approached spirituality and religiosity. And it became a much more personal experience. And for me, faith was deeply personal and had a great personal effect on me. It was a decision of my own, it was my own choice. I did it volitionally. And I'm in love with uh, the one who embodies the evangel, or from the Greek, evangelion, the good news. And what is that good news? To me, the good news is God's love for his human creation, for all of creation, as a matter of fact. But certainly, you know, the cornerstone text, or in this case, verse, in the Gospels, those four books of the New Testament that tell the story of Jesus, is John 3:16. It was the first Bible text or verse I memorized. And it goes like this: For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. So God's love for the world, to me, implies every human being in it, every part of it. So it's all about God's expansive love. And that's why I still embrace it. I would like to aspire, I'm not sure I always do, but I try to not just comprehend some part of that infinite love, but to know it and practice it as best I can. Uh, Love, I'm convinced, is the most powerful force in the universe. And I want to associate myself with that. So for me, that's what the evangel or being an evangelical or embracing evangelicalism is all about. I was tempted to abandon it when evangelicalism became politicized and, in fact, not just distanced itself, but may have abandoned that concept of a love-centered, love-oriented, love-driven faith. Um, but I don't want to surrender it either. Just because somebody steals it, illegitimately co-opts it, uh, doesn't necessarily mean that it no longer is what it is. And I'd like to try to preserve the best of it. So that's a long answer to your short question, um, but that would be the reason I wish to not just continue to embrace it as my own identity, but to maybe preserve the best of it because there's quite a history. American evangelicals were once abolitionists. They were once champions of women's rights. I like to remind people that the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York, 18, somebody knows the date better than I do, 46, 47, 48, anyway, late 1840s, early 19th century, was held where? In an evangelical church. I know, I can feel the shock. Uh, Evangelicals worked to end child labor practices at the turn of the last century. Um, we started to fall apart come the 1930s and 40s, maybe into the 50s. By the way, we were once largely conscientious objectors to war until the 1960s. So we have a very, um, variegated history. And I think parts of it deserve to be preserved. So it's another reason I try.
Thank you so much, Rob, for your honesty, for your resilience, for your ability at once to stand proudly for what you believe in and also to engage across difference. The work that we've done together has been a true blessing in my life. And I want to return to one pivot moment. In fact, when I met you on that rooftop, there was a screening of a film about you by Abigail Disney, an Emmy Award-winning film, in which providentially or by kismet, however one wishes to describe it theologically or atheologically, but Abby captured your transition, as it were, to a new or renewed vision of being an evangelical. And the linchpin, as it was presented in the film, was around gun violence in the United States. Can you walk us through that prolonged episode and what that meant in terms of the evolution of the movement, where it had arrived, what was increasingly agitating you? This was before the full rise of now President Trump, but it was a very dramatic and heartrending episode. So I think it's important to share that, in terms of your shift in consciousness.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for asking, and thank you for that memory again of our being up on that rooftop for that film screening. Yeah, Abby Disney, who's not only an award-winning documentarian, but also uh, a remarkable philanthropist who has uh, supported some of the best human endeavors of recent decades, and very smart, very educated and accomplished woman. I was sitting in my office on Capitol Hill one day when my assistant told me someone was trying to get in touch with me. Her name was Abigail Disney. The last name just went right over my head. I just didn't associate her with her very famous family, but she is part of the Disney entertainment uh, empire, I suppose. She is the granddaughter of Roy Disney, who built the Disney company, and the grandniece of Walt Disney, the creative genius behind Disney. So she was a child of great privilege, but is just stunningly humble, an ordinary person. And she came to see me and said, I want to challenge you to look at your religious family, American evangelicals, and particularly their embrace of popular gun culture, their advocacy for unfettered Second Amendment rights. And this had never occurred to me because I grew up in a part of New York State where if you had firearms in your home, you were likely either law enforcement or organized crime. But there was really no other reason to have a firearm. And there were a few hunters on the island I grew up on, but not many. And so it was a rather strange question. I knew that the support for the Second Amendment was just part of our sort of big constitutional package that had to do with personal freedoms, personal liberties. But I didn't give it much thought beyond that. And I asked her, why is she exploring this? She said, well, I don't know if you're aware of this, but American evangelicals are the most likely subgroup within the American population to own or have access to a firearm and to advocate for unfettered use, unregulated use of that firearm. And I'd like to explore why that's true. It took me a long time to say yes. I knew it was a volatile issue, no pun intended, in my world, but I took it on as a project out of my own curiosity. And we took a film crew across the country. We met with colleagues of mine all over the United States. We visited all kinds of, religious communities and so forth. And I discovered, to my shock and horror in some instances, that my colleagues, my friends, some of decades, one in particular, a pastor in Florida, whose pulpit I had visited many, many times over a 30-year period as a guest preacher. When I brought up the subject, I broached it with him in conversation, and he threw back his jacket and showed me his 9mm Glock semi-automatic handgun on his belt. And he said, I would never go into my pulpit without my weapon. And I said, you know, what do you imagine doing with it? He said, if somebody comes into my church and stands up in the sanctuary and yells in a language I don't understand, I'm going to take him out right from what we call the sacred desk, the pulpit. And I challenged him. I said, we use terms of endearment for each other. Brother and sister are terms that we use in that setting. And I said, my brother, are you suggesting that you would fire a bullet into a sanctuary filled with your own congregants? He said, yes. I said, if you, chances are you're going to strike the wrong person. By then, I had been through professional firearms training. I knew he had as well. I did it as research for my project. But I said, you've been trained as I've been trained. You know that you are far less likely to hit your subject with the first 3 rounds, and you're going to have to fire half a dozen before you hit your own target. What happens when you hit grandma in the third pew or her grandchild in the fifth pew? And he said, that's the price of defending the flock. So I knew we were in some kind of moral crisis. And that was particularly, I see Shai Franklin asking me here to link my thoughts with my anti-abortion activism. And this is a good place, Shai, for me to do that because uh, I had advocated for respect for the dignity and value of every human life. I've modified the parameters of that slightly, largely because of Jewish thought on this question of when life begins. I would define it back then as from conception until natural death. And the idea that anyone would treat human life uh, so with such disrespect in the way he was doing it told me my community was in deep moral crisis, and that's a thread throughout the film. And it was after that film was finished and released and would go on to win an Emmy, uh, it caused me to question a lot of what I had accepted as unquestionable dogma, uh, dicta, even doctrine. And so it would take me to the place I am now. I call myself a dissenting evangelical because I not only question, but I object to many of the tenets of faith that would lead my colleague and friend to that. One of the things I like to say about the position that my friend took with his weapon is in our respect for the Second Amendment, we must be very careful not to violate the Second Commandment. And obviously, the Second Commandment, as I count it anyway, is the commandment against, uh, you know, an idol, a something we create with our own hands. And in creating these weapons, we sometimes come to idolize them as our saviors in place of the divine savior that I've pledged my life to. So,
Rob, thank you for that too. I just want to ask if you could say one more sentence or two about the African American family that you met with and how that incredibly brave mother from Florida helped you to see exactly why you needed to engage in a deep process of discernment.
yes, you actually see in the film a real life unfolding of my encounter with Lucille. I know her as Lucy McBath. A lot of Americans do now because at the time I met her, she was a flight attendant for Delta Airlines living in Atlanta. Uh, Today, she is a third term, I'm losing count of the years, congresswoman from Georgia. Um, but when I met Lucy, it was only a short time after she had lost her only child, her son, 17-year-old Jordan, when in Jacksonville, Florida, he pulled up to a one of these, quick marts with three friends in a car. They were playing music, and a white contractor who was sitting in his pickup truck next to their vehicle complained to them to turn their music off, that it was annoying him. When they declined to do so with some level of respect for him, uh, he decided to open fire on their car with a semi-automatic handgun. Uh, he would kill Jordan. The others were spared any injury as they sped away. Um, and when he faced prosecution, when he was at trial, he defended himself by saying, "What else would a white guy do when there's a black car when there's a car full of black teenagers who are getting rowdy. Uh, he felt his life was threatened. He failed in his defense. He's in prison. I forget for how long, but he will serve a very long prison term. But it was in that encounter with Lucy McBath that I was somehow able to at least attempt to put myself in her seat and in her pain. And it was that encounter that helped me break out of sort of intellectual academic structure on this question of the Second Amendment and see the real consequences, particularly for a young man of color. Um, and that took me back to my own childhood when my father coached me to go and befriend the only Black family to move into our neighborhood. And there was a young boy my age, and my father said, "You may not, have ever thought of him as your friend, but he needs you as a friend." And that was my task, was to go over and be a companion to him. And that all happened in that moment you see in the film with Lucy, and I would go on to enjoy a wonderful, not just collaboration with Lucy, but friendship, deep friendship that remains to this moment. We pray for each other by text, which is just a lovely exchange I always look forward to with her.
Rob, thank you for narrating that very painful piece of the journey. And I do encourage people to see the film. It's, I think, still available through streaming Armor of Light. And again, it's directed and produced by Abigail Disney and her production company. Rob, I want to turn to the painful present, the complicated present. I am also hoping, yearning that you can provide us with some sparks of hope amidst, a time that feels like it is very precarious, to say the least. So if you could help us understand the resurgence of Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism, what you understand to be the relationship to members of the American evangelical public, and some of the fault lines and political battles within those contexts, and of course, what we might be able to do together across communities to push back.
Yeah, this is a serious, serious matter indeed, and one that many of my close colleagues are addressing. In fact, I want to give a shout out right away to Professor Mike Austin, who I think is in the frames here. Mike, I think I saw you come in, and I want to commend Mike, who is an evangelical himself, in fact, past president of the Evangelical Philosophical Society. Bet you didn't think there was one, but there is. And Mike is a professor of moral philosophy at Eastern Kentucky University. He's an active layman in his own church, and he's written a wonderful book on this subject that is only 78 pages long, so you have no excuse not to read it. American Christian Nationalism, Neither American Nor Christian. And it's an excellent insider's critique of this. Another colleague of mine, Mary Teresa Webb, I know as Terry Webb, has just released a similar treatment, Christian Citizenship Endangered in America. And I just heard two colleagues I've worked with through the years, been shoulder to shoulder with, uh, and who really speak for American evangelicals today. That's David French, who's a columnist at the New York Times. I met him when we were together at the very evangelical American Center for Law and Justice. He's an attorney and brilliant, insightful uh, 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 commentator on this subject. And of course, was on the other side of the argument, as I was for many years, on the subject of Christian nationalism. Uh, and he spoke with, what's the matter with me? I'm having a senior moment. Moore, my friend, I'll just call him Dr. Moore, the one of the editors of Christianity Today, which is um, the journal of record for American evangelicals. And they were discussing this crisis, both for the evangelical world and for the larger religious and American uh, citizenry. And, Mike, you helped me achieve a nice, pithy uh, description or definition of American Christian nationalism. And that is the notion that our founders established this country as a peculiar, and I use that term, um, intentionally, a peculiar Christian nation. That is a particular type of Christian nation, and that uh, quality should be both protected and advanced by law and policy. So, in other words, using the coercive powers of government to advance a particular religious idea, belief system, and subculture. Now we have that, well, let me interrupt myself, which I have a habit for doing here. And that is to say that that was essentially, or my project for 35 years, um, was to help bring about that reality. And that included campaigning heavily for candidates who I felt would carry out that vision and make it a political and social and legal reality in this country. Um, and I must tell you this because it was as early as 2011 that I sat in a room filled with evangelical luminaries, virtually all of the evangelical influencers um, in the country, celebrating the 80th birthday party of one of our icons, Pat Robertson, the founder of the Christian Broadcasting Network in Virginia Beach, Virginia, past presidential candidate himself, founder of the Christian Coalition, which arguably is one of the reasons Republicans were able to gain first a congressional majority in 1994, then elect George W. Bush, which set a certain direction and ultimately bring about the first term for Donald Trump, and even more so, a second term. So um, it was in that room watching Donald Trump as uh, Pat Robertson's guest of honor, which again stunned me when I was in Bible college, what we call seminary in my wing of evangelicalism, the place you are trained to be ordained clergy. I was told by my preaching instructor that when preparing a sermon, I should always look for a real life example to offer my hearers. And he said, for example, if you're treating the subject of infidelity to God, living in contradiction to God's commandments and will for our lives. You want to pull out a real life example. Who is somebody who illustrates living opposite to what we believe? And he said, you might use, for example, Donald Trump. This was way back in the early 80s when he was a young, guy hanging out in clubs in New York. But he was nevertheless, he was in the headlines for scandals. And I always thought of him in that way. And here he was, the guest of honor for one of our iconic figures in American evangelicalism during that time. And I asked a friend at the table, I said, why is Donald Trump here? And the answer came very quickly because he's a billionaire and Pat and he are in the same club now. Pat had sold the Family Channel, part of the Christian Broadcasting Network family of programs, to ABC Network. He became a billionaire anyway. Long story short, um, you know, this is part of how all of this developed. And for me, that was the beginning of the end. It would accelerate after my study of my own community's contradictions. But when I saw the construction of what we now know as Christian nationalism, it started, the antecedent to that was the Tea Party movement, which many evangelicals embraced heartily. And that has to do with the way we are formed as a people, culturally, if I can use the term, intellectually, and even spiritually. First of all, we're trained to listen unquestionably to authority, whether we see that in the text of the Holy Bible, the 66 books as we recognize them, of the Old, as we call it, Old and New Testaments, or whether it's the figures who arise in our movement. And some of those figures, they are called prophets, uh, instructed American evangelicals, particularly in a certain strain of charismatic Pentecostals who tend to be the core of Donald Trump and MAGA's religious constituency, um, enthusiasts really for both. Um, to question authority is seen as a form of spiritual rebellion. And in fact, there are verses in scripture that are used to denounce any form of questioning. For example, um, to question spiritual authority is to question God. And how dare one question God? Questioning is seen as a form of rebellion. Rebellion, as the Bible says, is as witchcraft. And who wants to be associated with witchcraft? Because witchcraft is associated with the devil and Satan, and I don't want to be associated with that, so I just won't open my mouth. I won't question anything. And that has set the stage for what we're seeing unfold now in this. Of course, it's nothing new. It's very old. You could go back to the nativists of the early 19th century and their hatred for Catholics and Jews and others. Um, so, in a way, this is a flashback. And that, frankly, leaves me optimistic that it can be at least contained, if not defeated and neutralized. And I think that there is both a religious and a non-religious way to accomplish that. So I'm not sure that answered your question, but I hope I didn't get lost in my own ruminations here.
Not at all. Not at all. And I could ask many more questions, but since we're about 10 minutes from the end of our session, I want to leave time for at least a few questions from folks who are here online. So if you want to just signal with a human hand or with an emoji or something in the chat, I probably won't be able to get to everyone. I apologize. But this is an invitation. Rob will be teaching in the fall and we'll share more information because this is a significant issue. And of course, it's one that we are all going to be thinking about more intensely as we approach the midterm elections. Julie Sweet, you're the first hand that I see. So if you just unmute yourself, go ahead, please.
Well, thank you very much. Hope you can hear me.
We can.
Thank you. So I would just like to share that I just finished reading a book called Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan Metzl. It sounds like you're familiar with the title. And he explores three issues. The first one that I found the most compelling, I think, was gun suicide in Missouri. But he determined a way to explain the great attachment that white people have to their guns, and I thought it was quite interesting. And I mean, I'm not going to go into it, but I guess I'll say this one little bit of history that struck me. He shared that in England, like in the 17th, 18th century, the only people who could own guns were like the aristocracy. And anybody who was of a lower class who owned a gun was assumed to be a poacher. Now you have a new society emerging in the colonies, and they need more people than just the gentry to own guns, because you have like Native American threat, you have the threat of possible Black uprisings and things like that. And what happened is that an idea about white privilege emerged from this related to gun ownership, and that's what so many people, even if they're not fully aware of it, are reluctant to give up. I'm going to let it go at that.
Well, thank you for bringing that into the discussion, because, of course, that's an element. And the whole question of gun ownership, gun use, self-defense, defense of our communities, etc., whether we delegate that to law enforcement, etc., the whole question of moral injury, which, interestingly enough, both the military and now more and more law enforcement agencies are actually giving the question of the damage done to the shooter, even if the shooting is justified. They see it as even deeper than a psychological matter, and really have asked chaplains to address this deep injury that individuals sustain when they are the shooter, not the subject of the shooting, but the shooter. So, but since you bring this up, there's another book I would like to commend to you, and we mentioned the course that I hope to teach in September and will announce. I think it's in the chat. I think some information, at least preliminary, is in the chat. I will reference many times the work of Charles Reagan Wilson. And the one book I want to mention by this Southern historian is this one, Baptized in Blood, The Religion of the Lost Cause. And there's the phenomenon of what I call the Southernization of American evangelicalism. This is, again, 182 pages, and I like shorter books because they're more easy to commit ourselves to. But this is dense with an examination of how, in the wake of the Civil War and the loss of the South, they were able to perpetuate their social constructs and concepts and ideals through the evangelical church. And my argument is they would eventually overtake the stream of American evangelicals I call the New Englanders, apropos to at least where we are situated at Hebrew College in Newton, Massachusetts. But this was an entirely different species of evangelicals. And they were quite the opposite of what the evangelical ethos was in the South. But eventually, in the early 1970s, the South would overwhelm the North. The Northern churches receded, the Southern churches exploded. And if you look at a mega church today, they are basically, in one form or another, closer to the Southern Baptist churches than they are anything else. So that would be something we're going to explore in depth, and the social, political consequences of that in gun policy, among many other things, will be implicated in that examination. So join the course. Join me in the course. I think it will be very, very helpful on all of these questions.
So, Rob, I also want to add that though it didn't come up yet today, if we had 2 hours or 3 hours, but certainly in the course, one of the subjects that's of urgent concern to the American Jewish community is, of course, the complicated and evolving relationship between American evangelicals, the American Jewish community, the state of Israel, Israelis, and Palestinians. And we once thought in the Jewish community, if I can speak in the we, that we understood the evangelical relationship to the state of Israel, to Israelis, to the North American Jewish community. But it has certainly become more complicated, fractured in the last several years. And as you said, the implications involve a whole series of issues, including the rise of anti-Semitism, this notion not only of Christian nationalism, but racialized white nationalism and what that has to do with Jewish identity and the identities of other minorities in this country. And so that too will be an important part of this course conversation because it's extremely painful, it's frightening, and we need to learn more. So the other thing that I'll say,
There's a tectonic shift going on,
right,
even within evangelicals
exactly.
vis-a-vis Israel, although we remain largely a Zionist, Christian Zionist movement,
Right.
but there's a change coming, and it demands to be examined, and we'll do
Exactly.
that.
Yeah. And Rob will be accompanied through the course with one or more rabbis from the Hebrew College community so that we can continue this dialogue. But we want to thank you, Rob, not only for today, but for your courage, your resilience, your commitment, as you said, in your own language, to tshuva. And thank you for being a partner, including coming in and studying in our Beit Midrash at Hebrew College whenever you are in Newton. So much more to come. And I'm going to turn things over to you, Kim, please.
Great. I have 20 seconds. I want to thank you, Rob, for your generosity in sharing your personal story, and to Orr for navigating the streets of Manhattan to come and be able to be in conversation. Hearing your story today gives us all lots to think about. And I hope that many will decide to continue that thinking when this course becomes available for the fall. It's not quite ready for prime time, so watch your emails. Each of you will receive an email either later today or tomorrow with a copy of this recording and some links to follow. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Our growth sessions are taking a little bit of a break over the summer, but we return in September, and we're looking forward to continuing to learn together, to grow together, and wishing you all a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you so much for being here.
Take care, everyone. More to come.